On Saturday evening, my son Noah arrived at the beach house, leading his girlfriend's family, the Mercers, like a prince returning to his palace. They expected a private tour of his new home. Instead, they stepped onto the veranda and found me, Evelyn Archer, mic'd up, lights blazing, answering questions for a national TV segment about the property I bought and the marine education center I'm building here. The cameras turned. Noah's practiced smile fractured. I don't teach with shouting. I teach with truth, especially under a lens that doesn't blink. That night, status collided with values, luxury with purpose, and every carefully polished story met the tide. When the waves hit the rocks, masks fall fast. Stay, because the most expensive thing we own isn't a view. It's the truth we've been avoiding. Saturday's sunlight lacquered the ocean like poured glass when the Mercers stepped onto my veranda and saw the thing none of them expected. Me, Evelyn Archer, already mic'd, framed by light stands, a boom hovering above my shoulder, and Tessa Caldwell asking, "Tell us why this house matters." The camera panned. Noah's smile did what thin ice does in late spring. It cracked with a sound you can't quite hear, but absolutely feel. He'd rehearsed this moment for days. The confident tour, the casual gesture toward his horizon, the unspoken narrative that he'd arrived. Instead, he met a lens that does not blink, and a mother who had finally decided to stop blinking with it. If you freeze that frame, the precise beat where his hand lifts to present my view and stalls midair, you can see the entire story balanced on his fingertips. His girlfriend Sloane Mercer, elegant in a summer dress that whispered more money than most people make in a year, stiffened the way people do when they sense a joke they're not in on. Her father, Graham Mercer, founder of Mercer Atelier, wore the brand like a second skin. Hand-stitched loafers, the kind of casual blazer that costs more than a used car, the posture of a man who understands that attention is currency. Beside him, Adriana Mercer's smile hovered, immaculate and uncertain. They all turned toward me, and I gave the smallest nod a mother gives when she has finally decided to say out loud what everyone has been pretending not to know. "Roll sound," Tessa said softly. The truth is, by the time they arrived, the fuse had already burned most of the way down. The call came on a Tuesday, the kind of clean-shadowed California morning when the wind carries salt and eucalyptus, when plans feel like they might actually stick. I was at the long table in the sunroom, tracing a path across the final land schematics with my index finger, setting the native grasses along the bluff line, noting the interpretive signage for the tidal pool exhibit I'd wanted to build since before I could afford to imagine such a thing. My phone lit with Noah's name. I didn't sigh. I've learned not to waste breath on what you can't change. But I did set the pen down with care, as if gentleness could keep a conversation from breaking. "Mom, I need a favor," he said, in that easy old tone that used to mean, "Can I stay up late? Can I skip practice? Can I borrow the car?" "What kind of favor, Noah?" My voice steady, neutral. I've sat across from bankers and planners who mistook my linen for softness. Neutral can be a blade when you know how to hold it. "Something came up this weekend," he said. "Could you postpone moving into the beach place? Just for 2 days." Then, the practiced casualness I knew too well. "I want to show some friends the area, and it would be perfect if they could stay there." The beach place. As if it were an Airbnb with better soap. As if it weren't the Harbor Point home I'd bought 6 months earlier. The house with the sweeping eastern windows and the hewn stone steps down to the rocks. The one I paid for with decades of dawn meetings and skin-thin margins, and the stubborn insistence that sustainable communities could be both beautiful and profitable. $6 million of wind and water and the quiet that comes to women who have worked too long to apologize for arriving. What friends would these be? I asked, though I already knew. In Noah's world lately, friends had begun to mean witnesses. He cleared his throat. "Sloane's parents are in town," he said, and the word parents stretched like taffy. "The Mercers, I told you about them." "The handbag people," I said, and heard the petty in it. Mercer Atelier was more than handbags, and we both knew it. They sold aspiration in leather and steel and the invisible thread that stitches a person's sense of worth to the cost of a belt. "They're a full luxury lifestyle brand," he corrected, a little edge there, the kind you get when you've started rehearsing another family's language. They're very interested in beachfront investments, if they like the area. He let the implication hang. I could feel the house around me, the way it sat inside the landscape instead of on top of it, the way the glass accepted morning and gave evening back. I thought of the schematic in front of me, the hand-lettered marine learning nook, the small illustration of a child kneeling by a tide pool, pointing into a world we normally only step over. "So," I said, "you want them to believe the house is yours?" Silence on the line, then a laugh that couldn't pick a direction. "Not exactly," he said. "I just thought it would be nice if we didn't have to explain everything. About how you—" He stopped, then tried again. "About how you live. How I live. The sensible shoes that put me through construction sites without twisting an ankle. The 3-year-old sedan I could replace tomorrow but didn't. The pantry stocked like we might host a neighborhood after a storm. To the Mercers, I suppose, a woman like me is a riddle. Wealth without the decals, arrival without a parade. To Noah, lately, I had begun to look like an obstacle to a story he wanted told about him, and told now. There's a great hotel in Oak Ridge Bay," he said quickly. "I'll book you a spa weekend. My treat." My treat? The part of me that writes checks large enough to command respect from men who would rather not give it, almost laughed. Another part, the part that held my boy in the dawn after his father died, the part that taught him to read blueprints on a laminate kitchen table, lay down the pen and measured the shape of a lesson. Some truths arrive like a letter. Others, you have to hand-deliver. "Actually," I said, "I was planning to be out this weekend anyway. You're welcome to use the house." The lie slid through my teeth like thread through a needle. I jabbed the call button for my assistant, and then another for a number I hadn't dialed since last winter. "Tessa Caldwell's office," a crisp voice answered. "This is Evelyn Archer," I said, watching gulls knife the sky beyond the glass. "About the segment for Homes with Heart. I'm wondering if Miss Caldwell is available this Saturday instead." By noon, we had a schedule. By 2, a story. By nightfall, the tide was doing what it always does, coming in, going out, wearing down what resists it. I stood at the railing and thought about the first time I chose not to buy the more expensive thing. A car that would have made meetings easier, doors lighter, nods automatic. I thought about the small boy who had asked why the one we had wasn't enough. I wondered at what age a child's questions become answers you have to live up to. Saturday came clean and blue, the wind lifting the edges of the white umbrellas like someone turning pages. The production van eased down the gravel, and the crew spilled out with the competence of people who put stories in boxes and send them across the country every week. They moved through the rooms with a deference that surprised me, touching nothing they didn't have to, noticing everything. "You built with the coast rather than at it," a young assistant said as she clipped the transmitter to the inside of my linen blouse. "It feels placed, not planted." "That was the point," I said. "A house should be a good neighbor." She smiled, eyes darting to the sketches pinned to the corkboard. "Tessa wants to feature your education center plans," she said. "Our viewers love purpose." At 1:30 they powdered my forehead and tamed a few strands the breeze kept freeing. I put on the pale blue shirt I'd worn the day I signed the closing papers. It isn't lucky. I don't believe in that, but it is a reminder. You can be gentle and still sign something irrevocable. At 1:45, Tessa walked in with a presence television flattens and only real life can explain. Smaller than she looks on screen, yes, but bright in a way that lights bend toward. "Evelyn," she said, clasping my hand in both of hers. "The profile we ran in the journal about Archer Eco Developments was a hit. I've been eager to sit here with you." I wanted to deflect, to perform the dance women of my generation learned too young. Oh, it was luck, it was timing, it was the team. But there are days to set the table, and days to eat what you cooked. "It's good to have you," I said. "Let's tell a story that deserves the space it takes." At 2:00, the red tally light blinked on. Tessa asked about beginnings, and I gave them to her. The drafting table in a garage that still smelled like motor oil. The nights I fell asleep calculating runoff coefficients and woke to pack lunches. The refusal to design subdivisions that shaved hills down and sold the shavings as landscaping. She asked about wealth, and I told her the thing I'd had to learn twice. Money is loud if you use it to yell, quiet if you use it to build. I answered in full sentences and sometimes in fragments, because honest things don't always arrive with grammar. We were back on the veranda, the ocean doing its shimmering trick, when the tires on the gravel told me the scene partner I'd written into this day had arrived. Voices, cheerful, practiced. The cadence of a tour guide who has watched enough listing videos to know where to pause for impact. And this, Noah said, rounding the corner with his arms spread wide, is where He stopped. The breath left him like a wave sucking back from the rocks. In the space where he meant to say I drink my coffee, his mouth formed a small O and held. Behind him, Sloane's eyes cut to the camera, to Tessa, to my face, then back to Noah's as if she could triangulate a lie into a truth. Graham lifted his chin, scanning the equipment, the cables, the people who had turned his afternoon from a showcase into a reveal. Adriana's fingers found the strap of her bag and stayed there, a reflex older than fashion. "Hi, darling," I said. "Perfect timing. We're filming a segment for Homes with Heart about the property and the community programs we're building here. Come say hello." "Hello," Tessa said, all professional warmth, the kind that can welcome or scorch depending on how close you stand. "You must be Noah. We were just talking about your mother's vision for Harbor Point." He looked at me, then at the crew, then at the Mercers, and for a moment my son, a man who can talk his way out of a moving elevator, could not find a single word. I watched the boy inside the man's surface, the one who once asked me why the ocean didn't get tired. "It's always moving," I'd said back then. "It doesn't have to be dramatic to change the shore." Graham Mercer stepped forward, cool as a measured pour. "We were invited," he said to me, not unkindly, but with the clarity of someone who has trained entire markets to listen when he speaks. "To see Noah's new home." 1,000 possible sentences crowded the doorway of my mouth. I chose the one that wouldn't make this another episode of a show I used to live in. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," I said. "This is my home. Noah is always welcome here." I let the camera have the smallest turn of my wrist toward the beyond. "So is anyone who understands what we're trying to do with this coastline." Sloane's face had gone pale, the color of porcelain that has been displayed, not used. "Noah," she whispered. It wasn't a question, but it asked one anyway. He swallowed hard, and for a heartbeat, I saw the horizon settle in his eyes. I've watched men talk their way through storms and drown in inches of water, and I've watched them find a footing in the truth and walk out soaked but breathing. My son looked at me, then at the crew, then at the family he wanted to impress, and realized that every route back to dignity began at the same place, the start. "It's my mother's," he said, voice steadying on the second word. "I asked if we could use it. I should have told you the whole story." Tessa's camera operator shifted to catch the Mercer's reaction, and to their credit, they didn't perform outrage. Graham's jaw flexed once, Adriana's mouth softened by a millimeter. Sloane's grip on her bag loosened, as if something tight inside her had been waiting for permission to exhale. "Since we're all here," Tessa said, not missing a beat, "she's built for tides. Perhaps you'd like to join us for a few questions about coastal stewardship and purpose-driven ownership. We can always blur faces if anyone prefers privacy in the final cut." The offer was real, the out was real, and so was the invitation to stay. Noah looked at me. I nodded, not as a signal of victory, but as the only blessing I could give him. "You can walk toward this, and I will not leave you." He turned back to the others. "Let's stay," he said quietly. We talked for 20 more minutes, and if I tell you I remember every word, I'd be lying. What stays are impressions. Tessa's talent for finding the hinge in a conversation and swinging it open. Graham's careful, almost scientific attention when I described the native planting plan. Adriana's face when I explained that schoolchildren would file down the hewn steps to put their hands in tide pools that, for decades, had been something you glimpsed from a deck and called yours. What stays is Sloane kneeling beside the lower railing to watch a rush of tiny silver fish turn at once like a single thought, and the way she breathed, "God, that's beautiful," as if no camera had ever existed. When the red light went dark and the crew broke to reset for the interior shots, Noah asked me, "Can we talk?" He didn't avoid the camera. He didn't grab my elbow and drag me away like a boy in trouble. He stood where he was, on the veranda his mother had built inside a life she refused to borrow, and waited. Of course, I said. We stepped just inside the French doors, close enough to see the ocean riffled by wind through the glass. He pressed his palms to the edge of the table, like a penitent to a rail. I shouldn't have lied, he said. I mean. He flinched at the word and corrected himself like a man pulling a splinter the right direction. I shouldn't have let them believe a story I knew they wanted. Why did you? I asked, not as a mother demanding restitution, but as a woman who has sold an idea to the world, one building at a time, and knows you can't fix a faulty foundation if you won't name the rot. Because it's easier to be who they already admire, he said. Because sometimes I think if I look like I've arrived, I will. Because I'm your son, and you keep pretending none of this is a big deal. He gestured, not just at the house, but at the work behind it, the pages of sketches and the binders of permits and the bank statements like ledgers from a war. And then I don't know how to wear pride without putting it on like a costume. There it was, the soft underbelly of the animal we'd both been feeding scraps. I wanted to touch his cheek the way I did when fever glazed it and sing those old incantations about enoughness and grace. Instead, I chose the narrow path between apology and sermon. I never pretended, I said. I chose to keep my center of gravity where it couldn't be bought. But I'm sorry if my choosing looked like shame to you. I let that sit. Pride is not a costume, it's a fit. You tailor it with the work you actually do. He stared at the sketches on the table. If I told them who I actually am, a marketing manager, not a VP, a renter, not an owner, would they still want me at their table? Then maybe, I said, you'll find a better table. Outside, I heard Tessa's voice lift, calling, "Back in 5." We rejoined the others, and if I tell you the next segment was easy, I'd be lying again. There was a moment when Graham's businessman reflex clicked and he asked, in that crisp tone that has closed deals in 3 continents, whether opening private coastline to public school children wasn't inviting chaos. I didn't bristle. I explained the scheduling system, the chaperone ratios, the boardwalk grant proposal laced with federal language he didn't expect a developer to quote without notes. He looked at me differently then, not with softness, not yet, but with the respect men learn to withhold until it costs them something. Last question, Tessa said, hearing the wind pick up, feeling the story crest. If you had to choose one sentence to guide your life here, what would it be? I looked past the glass to where the water kept doing its ancient work. Build what outlasts you, I said, and try not to need applause while you do it. The boom operator swallowed, a small, involuntary sound of a person who didn't expect to feel anything at work. And that's when the first gull cried, and the light turned that late afternoon honey. Somewhere behind me, a crew member whispered, "Magic hour." And somewhere inside me, something that had braced for impact finally let go. We wrapped the exterior just before the fog stitched itself across the far edge of the horizon. The crew moved inside. The Mercers debated, in quiet voices, whether to stay for a kitchen shot or call it an afternoon. Sloane lingered by the sketches, running a finger along a contour line the way you trace a familiar road on a map, not because you don't know it, but because you need to remember how it feels. "What would you do?" I asked her softly, surprising both of us, "if you weren't adjusting your life to fit a showroom?" She blinked, then smiled with something startlingly young beneath it. "I studied biophilic design," she said, before other priorities. I miss thinking about how buildings can teach people their place in an ecosystem." "Maybe you should keep thinking that," I said. She nodded, and the nod felt less like agreement than like a door closing on one room and opening on another. I don't know if you can hear it through a screen. The quiet that comes after a truth has been said and nobody died. It sounds like wind at last getting through a window that's been painted shut for years. It sounds like a tide turning. It sounds, if you listen close, like a woman breathing in her own house without having to make herself smaller to fit it. This is where the segment would cut to B-roll. Waves rushing the rocks, the camera skimming the boardwalk, a child's hand in a tide pool we haven't built yet. But what happened in the beat between rap and goodbye is the honest start of this story. Noah touched my shoulder. Not the way a son asks for something, not the way a man claims space, but the way people do when they mean, "Thank you and I'm sorry, and I'm not sure which matters more." Let me know when you need help with the learning nook, he said. I can design the donor materials. No gloss, just what's true. Deal, I said. Behind him, Graham watched us with an expression I can only describe as revised. Adriana's posture softened by degrees. Sloane turned her face toward the sound of the ocean and smiled like someone who has just remembered her first language. Out on the rocks, the tide had turned without asking permission from a single human on shore. That's the thing about the ocean. It doesn't need you to say yes to do what it does. It will, however, teach you how to move if you decide to learn. Fog thinned to gauze as we moved down the hewn stone steps toward the boathouse, the crew floating around us like a school of bright, efficient fish. Cables rose and fell over shoulders, a reflector flashed, and Tessa walked backwards with the grace of someone who's learned to interview while navigating stairs. We'll take the shoreline segment in one pass, she called, and the ocean answered with a sigh that had crossed whole hemispheres to get here. Behind me, Sloane's sandals tapped a soft impatience I recognized. Not nerves exactly, but the itch you feel when something you love is close enough to touch, and you're not sure you're allowed. The boathouse door slid back and cool salt air rushed us, the kind that folds into your lungs like a childhood memory. Inside, I had taped hand sketches on foam board, cross-sections of learning stations, tide lines drawn in pencil smudged to shadow, a watercolor wash of the planned touch tanks. The crew swept cameras across them. A monitor blinked alive with our world in miniature. We're reclaiming this space, I said, voice steady for the boom. Not as a toy for a single owner, but as a room that belongs to sea light and small hands. Places where a child can kneel and meet a world they've stepped over all their lives. Sloane drifted closer, her shadow overlapping mine on the concrete floor. She traced, not touching, the arc of a skylight I'd drawn to frame the winter sun. You angled this to soften glare off the water, she murmured, more to the sketch than to me. It teaches the light to behave, I said, and she smiled, a quick, involuntary curve that made her look 10 years younger and a little more like a girl who once stayed up past midnight resizing models for a critique. Graham, who had refused the stairs to the tide pools on principle, had followed this far. No loafers sacrificed, but posture softened by curiosity. Cost? He asked, crisp as invoice paper. Less than the marketing budget for a mid-tier handbag launch, I replied without heat. But the return is measured in something you can't put in a deck. A fourth grader who goes home knowing the difference between a limpet and a conch, between a coastline kept and a coastline sold off, one view at a time. Tessa cut in before he could volley. Walk us through the learning path. We filed out, past the racks that once held kayaks and now held laminated diagrams. The shore below was slick with spill tide, little starbursts of anemone pulsing like breathing stones. A camera operator found the angle that turned a tide pool into a chapel, sky framed by rock, a window looking up from the underworld. We'll install footings here, I said, pointing to the places I'd memorized by tripping on them, and a removable boardwalk that lets kids lean without crushing what they came to see. Sloane stepped down without waiting for permission, kneeling with a kind of reverence you can't manufacture. She leaned over the water, and the camera leaned with her. Something bright flickered beneath the surface, and she laughed, a sound so unguarded, Adriana's head snapped toward her, like she'd heard a language she hadn't realized her daughter still spoke. Look, Sloane breathed. See stars? Juveniles. See how the arms are. She stopped herself, glanced at the lens, and colored, embarrassed by the way expertise had slipped out of her like a secret. Keep going, Tessa coaxed. Our viewers like to be taught. Sloane glanced at me. I nodded. She pointed to an orange star wedged between two rocks, her hands steady and gentle. They're not decorations, she said. They're engineers. They keep balance in the pool. Take them away and everything else tips. The boom operator swallowed, the same reflex I'd heard earlier, and Graham, who sells balance in boxes tied with ribbon, stared as if he'd mispriced the world. We gave the ocean her close-up. Kids will come here, I said to camera and coast. Kids who've never been allowed beyond the boardwalk rope. Kids who think coast is a word for a picture on a phone. They'll learn the names for what they stand on. You can't love what you can't name. You don't fight for what you don't love. Graham asked logistical questions. Liability, Scheduling? Security, and I answered with measures and ratios and a quiet rage you might mistake for patience. The tide ticked higher. On the rocks above us, a gull cocked its head, the ancient auditor. We climbed back up and the crew set a small scene in the kitchen. A pour-over kettle, a bowl of clementines, light falling in squares across butcher block like a quilt your grandmother made from old shirts. Just natural sound here, Tessa said. Let's breathe. Adriana ran a finger across the counter edge, checking for grit, and addressed me as if we shared the same club membership. I do hope you have reliable help, she said. A space like this is demanding. I do, I said. Public school volunteers with a backbone you could build piers on. Sloane choked back a grin, and the camera caught it. Malicious only if you've never seen a generational truce negotiated by a daughter with a single facial expression. Noah hovered in the doorway, the shape of a question in his shoulders. Can I help? Can I fix? Can I be, finally, more than charm? Hand me the mugs, I said. He did, and in that small exchange something re-threaded between us. Old rope turned in new hands. Before we roll again, Tessa told the room, I'd love a quick beat on legacy. Of course, Graham said smoothly, stepping into frame as if it had been built for him. At Mercer Atelier from Evelyn first, Tessa cut, not cruel, just exact. The lens found me. I wasn't wearing makeup that could bully an answer into place. When I was 27, I said, I built a cul-de-sac I'm still ashamed of. It sold out in a week. The profits gave me runway. And then an early winter storm turned clay to soup and a creek to a new course. And I stood in borrowed boots watching a backhoe scoop what used to be a salamander's home into a truck. I lifted a shoulder. The fabric whispered. That night my son asked why I smelled like mud. I told him I built a place that wasn't kind to the place it was in. He asked why I couldn't build a kind one. Did you? Tessa asked. Not the next day, I said. But the next year. And then the next. Sloane stared at the clementines like they held an answer to a question she hadn't dared ask at 16. Graham shifted, unready for the part of the story that doesn't fit a brand Bible. Adriana's bracelet chimed softly against her watch, the small music money makes when it doesn't have anything else to say. We moved to the long window and gave the ocean her second act. The light went from white to amber in 15 minutes. California always hurries the magic hour, like a director who's losing the sun. Tessa drew a line through the philosophy and into the thing everyone cares about but pretends not to. Image. You've built what most people would call a quiet fortune, she said to me. You don't display it the way our culture teaches. What do you say to those who believe visibility is a responsibility? I say visibility is a choice, I answered. Responsibility isn't. Graham couldn't let it float. And yet, he said, gesturing gently at the horizon as if he'd invented it, this house, I agreed, is both an indulgence and a promise. I'm not above a beautiful window. I'm also not above opening it. Silence took the room for a beat. Outside, a pelican cut a clean line through the air and folded itself into the water with the kind of grace that makes you rethink your posture. Tessa, who knows when to shut up better than anyone on daytime TV, let the moment sit, then pivoted like a dancer. Sloane, she said softly, what do you see when you look at this space? Sloane kept her eyes on the water, but spoke to us. A building that understands the wind, she said, which means a person who listened first. Tessa let the crew breathe out, then called reset. People drifted. A mic battery swapped, a grip coiled cable into a perfect figure 8. Adriana made a note in a leather planner so lovely I wanted to forgive it everything it represented. I felt Noah at my elbow before he was there. I need to fix what I broke, he said under the hum, and I looked at him, really looked, the way you look at weather. Not to judge it, but to prepare. Start small, I said, start true. I told Sloane's parents I'm a manager, not an executive, he said quickly, the words tripping over each other like kids late to class. I told them I rent and my couch is from a warehouse sale and I wanted to use your house because I'm tired of being almost. How did it go? I asked. Graham said aspiration is a strategy, Noah replied, grim. I said it's a costume if you never take it off. He breathed, trying on honesty like a jacket that finally fits. He respected the pushback more than the performance. On cue, Graham approached us, Adriana a pace behind, posture proprietary by default. He didn't preface with charm. Miss Archer, he began, then corrected himself. Evelyn, I misjudged the nature of your project. He wasn't apologizing. He was revising a thesis. Mercer Atelier is exploring experiential verticals. Your marine education could intersect with our foundation's outreach. I thought of boardrooms where men confuse a check with consent. I thought of a boathouse that could be corrupted by sponsorship plaque. Outreach is a good word, I said. It sounds like giving without touching. He blinked. Adriana's mouth pressed thin, but not unkind. Sloane, listening from the threshold, looked like someone watching a surgeon cut where she'd always wanted the incision. I don't accept money with strings, I told Graham. Just knots we tie together. He held my gaze, then the smallest smile, sharp, sporting, the look of a man who's found a sparring partner worthy of the gloves. Noted. Tessa clapped twice, and the room snapped back to set. Final segment, intergenerational values. Keep it candid, keep it clean. We stood in a semicircle that didn't look like one on camera. I spoke first, because the only thing worse than going first is not being invited at all. I tried to teach my son that money is a tool, I said. He found out it's also a mirror. We don't always like what we see. Noah didn't flinch. I've been polishing the mirror, he said, instead of building the room. Sloane went next, unscripted, and you could feel it. I've been decorating rooms I don't want to live in, she said, a laugh catching on the way out, because it photographs better than what I actually care about. Adriana's chin lifted, pride battling protocol. Presentation matters, she said. It came out reflex before it became belief. But perhaps it isn't the whole of things. Graham exhaled like he'd been asked to admit the ocean is wet. Substance sells longer, he said, and for him that was a confession. We wrapped on the veranda while the sun poured itself into the horizon like honey into tea. The director called cut, and the spell broke in the practiced way spells on sets always do. Clatter, laughter, the bodily relief of humans who've held still too long. Crew flowed past with thank yous and goodbyes. Tessa hugged me, low-voiced. You gave them something real, she said. Real scares people at first, then it feeds them. Come back when the first busload of kids arrives, I told her. Bring a poncho. They splash. She grinned, then was whisked to the van by a PA with a checklist that could run a small country. The driveway swallowed the production vehicles. Quiet took the house back like a tide reclaiming sand. We didn't rush to fill it. Graham wandered the veranda like a man casing a gallery, seeing the value of pieces he can't buy. Adriana checked her phone, frowned at whatever universe lives there, and then, shockingly, put it away. Sloane walked the length of the window, fingertips trailing above the sill like she was playing a song only she could hear. Noah stuck his hands in his pockets, then pulled them out. The thing boys do when they decide not to hide. I'd like to help, Sloane said finally, turning to me with a look I recognized from Studio Crits, the one that means I know I'll be working until morning, and I don't care. Not as a Mercer. As an architect who forgot that's what she was. Titles can wait, I said. Bring me a concept for how we shepherd 3 classes from bus to boathouse without trampling a single living thing. Her eyes lit. Wayfinding through sound instead of signs, she said instantly. Low chimes along the path, each note tied to a stop. Children follow the melody. No one runs because they're listening. Adriana's lips parted, protest rising, then tangled with wonder. She closed her mouth and let the idea hang. Graham's eyes flickered with the instinct to monetize, then, miracle, settled. He saw the elegance first. Send me a deck, I told Sloane, then immediately corrected myself. No deck. Sketches, hand-drawn, grease pencil, let the wind in. She laughed, delighted to be given a homework assignment that didn't need a font. Noah shifted closer. Mom, he said, then stopped, and we both heard how small the word still is, no matter how tall a man gets. I'm going to host a viewing night when the episode airs. Invite people I've performed for, and tell the truth in a room that will answer back. I looked at him and felt the ache of pride on the underside of the rib, where it hides behind worry. It'll hurt, I said. Then it'll heal. Will you come? He asked. This house has a television, I said, and a son who knows where the mugs go. I let him see the yes without making a ceremony of it. He nodded, eyes bright, then wiped them with the heel of his hand like a boy who just realized crying isn't a failure of plumbing. The Mercers gathered themselves to leave, the choreography of wealth reasserting itself. Keys, glasses, a check that isn't written but hums in the air like a promise. At the door, Graham hesitated. "You were right," he said. "Outreach without touch is advertising." And, I asked not to gloat, but because we were halfway to a bridge, and I wanted him to feel the boards under his shoes. "And touch requires risk," he said. "We'll bring gloves." "Leave them in the car," I said, and he surprised us both by laughing. They walked to their car the way people do after a gallery opening, slower than necessary, talking not about what they saw but about what it rearranged inside them. The engine purred. The gravel spoke. Silence closed behind them, like a door on a room that will still be there in the morning. Night pressed its forehead to the glass. In the kitchen, I rinsed the mugs and let them dry face down on the rack. Noah leaned against the counter, the way men do when they have something to confess and don't know where the priest is. "I've been reading MBA program pages," he said, like a teenager admitting to Googling something inappropriate. "Sustainable enterprise, not because of your house," he added quickly, as if distance could prove sincerity. "Because of your work, because I'm tired of borrowing an aura." I didn't clap or cry. I nodded once. The approval men have told me all my life they don't need, and then spent fortunes to chase. "Bring me your list," I said. "We'll read small print." We stood there a while longer, not saying anything. Outside, the ocean did what it always does, moved the line without asking permission. Inside, I let the day uncoil. The part of me that had staged a public lesson checked for bruises and found fewer than feared. The part of me that has built whole neighborhoods from lines on paper felt the new lines form. A walkway of sound, a bus idling quietly beside a boathouse, a young woman with a pencil behind her ear, a man my son's age hosting a party and surviving it. Before bed, I stepped onto the veranda one last time. The air was wet silk. Harbor Point blinked itself into constellations up and down the coast, porches, dock lights, windows with stories behind them. Somewhere a child brushed his teeth and stared at a wobbly tooth, privately negotiating with pain. Somewhere, a woman turned a deadbolt and felt the click in her bones. Somewhere, a man checked the locks twice, unwed because he was raised to do so, and then slept for the first time in weeks without dreaming of falling. Down on the rocks, the tide reached for itself and found it, and I stood where the camera had stood and thought about what image does to a life. It can flatten it, it can frame it. Sometimes, rarely if you're careful and lucky, it can hold it long enough for someone to see what was always there and say, "I didn't know." And then do. Behind me, the floor hushed under familiar feet. Noah pressed a palm on the door jamb like he was taking the house's pulse. "I'll be here early tomorrow," he said. "We can go over those programs, maybe draft a letter to the district about the field trips." "Bring coffee," I said. "You owe the house that much." He grinned, easy for the first time all day. "Deal." When his door closed down the hall, I traced the railing with 2 fingers, like a blessing you can give wood. I have built things that will outlast me. I have also built a day that might outlast a handful of bad habits, which is a different kind of architecture. In the dark glass, my face looked like a shoreline. Eroded here, stubborn there, carved into something truer by weather. I raised my hand to it, not waving, not checking, just honoring a woman who finally decided that if her son was going to learn the shape of truth, he might as well learn it by feel. 3 weeks later, the ocean did what it always does, kept moving, while the rest of us held our breath. The network cut a 30-second teaser that made the house look like a confession booth with better light. A producer texted to say pre-broadcast interest was off the charts, which is television for don't blink. I told myself I didn't care who watched. The Tide has never once checked ratings before coming in. But that evening, I set a glass of wine on the veranda rail like an anchor and angled the armchair toward the TV, the way you angle yourself toward a conversation you aren't sure you want to have. Noah hosted the viewing party in his apartment. His idea, his invitation list, his risk. He'd sent a message to colleagues, friends, people he'd overperformed for and underdelivered to. "I'll be answering questions after," he wrote. "Come hungry for the truth. I didn't go." Some reckonings belong to a man and the room he's made for them. But when the opening music swelled and the first aerial shot of Harbor Point slid across my screen, my phone buzzed with a brief text. "We're rolling. No emoji, no bravado, Just the line a man throws to the person he wants on shore when he dives. Tessa's voice drew the map. A quiet fortune, a coastline, a question of what wealth is for. The edit was kind. Not soft, she isn't built for soft, but true. It let the camera listen. It let the day breathe. It let my flint edge without turning me into a sermon. When they cut to the moment on the veranda, the turn, the catch in Noah's throat, the Mercers' faces rearranging themselves around a new center, the room around my TV felt suddenly crowded with all the versions of my life I didn't pick. The one where I moved into a glassier neighborhood earlier. The one where I taught my son that a decal was a value. The one where we skipped the hard part and smiled for the drone. When the credits rolled, I didn't stand up. The phone filled the silence with vibrations. First, Noah. That was both worse and better than expected. People are quiet. That's new. A beat later, a second message. I'm gonna talk now. Wish me courage. I replied with a single word, enough. He knew what I meant. Not good luck, not be smart. Be enough. Your actual size. Then the unexpected. A text from a number I didn't recognize, followed by a name. Graham Mercer. Well cut. Less sensational than I feared, more instructive than I expected. I'd like to continue our conversation about touching without gloves. I let the line sit. A habit of mine. Don't answer a man who's already rehearsed the response he wants from you. Another message blinked in. Sloane. The episode aired at my parents' townhouse and everyone had opinions, some loud, some useful. 3 inquiries for sustainable design consults within 20 minutes. I'm sketching the wayfinding chimes. Can I send you photos? I wrote back before I could outthink myself. Send sound if you can. Drawings will follow. Later that night, when the ocean had turned black enough to show the moon her face, Noah called. We're done, he said. In the background, I could hear the soft clatter of a room removing itself. Bottles, plates, footsteps. I told them about the lies. I told them about wanting to be a costume that got me into the room. I told them I'm done dressing up as a different man. How did they take it? I asked. Some of them laughed in that way people laugh when they're embarrassed for you, he said. 1 person left. 2 stayed late. One of them, the director at work who scares everyone, said the campaign I pitched last month looks different to him now. Cleaner, he said. Less borrowed sheen. I don't know if that means I'm fired or promoted. His voice tilted into a smile. It means you're seen. He exhaled, a long breath he'd been saving for years. I'm applying, he said, almost shy. MBA programs, sustainable enterprise focus. I know that sounds like a midlife patch job. It sounds like architecture, I said. You're building the room you want to stand in. The morning after the broadcast, Harbor Point woke like it always does. Gulls, laundry, a jogger with headphones pretending he isn't looking at the ocean every 6 steps. My inbox, however, looked like a street after a parade. There were notes from former colleagues who used to wear their skepticism like armor and now wanted to grab coffee. There were emails from school principals and a PTA president who had never seen a tide pool in person but could mobilize 25 parents by Tuesday. There were also the other kind, the men who offer to buy the thing they didn't help make, the brands who think slapping a logo on a railing is participation. I triaged with the rigor of someone who has learned the difference between attention and support. One I can get by walking down a street with a camera. The other asks what time to be here and shows up early with a broom. By noon, Sloane's files pinged through. Quick iPhone audio clips of soft metal tones, each chime a note you wanted to chase, sketches in graphite of posts set back from plants, paths that curled with the land instead of cutting it. Arrows made of negative space. She'd drawn children not as stock art, but as quick shapes in motion. Knees, elbows, the small concentration of a body leaned toward a new world. In the margin of one sheet she'd written, in her neat designer hand, "Teach listening first." I called her. "You remembered sound before sight," I said. "People run toward what they see," she said, equal parts apology and pride. "They slow down for what they hear." "Come walk the site Monday," I told her. "Bring shoes you don't mind ruining. Bring your father if he wants to see what generous looks like." "I'll bring my mother," she said, laughing. "She needs proof the ocean isn't just a backdrop." She arrived with a rolled tube and a canvas bag that had seen better fundraising galas. Adriana followed, wearing sneakers that belonged to a different woman than the one on my veranda weeks ago. We walked the path in silence, the good kind. Sloane placing a chime postmarker with a dowel rod and a question. Here, sometimes I said yes, sometimes I said, closer to the wind line, let it find the note. Adriana listened with her hands in the pockets of a jacket that didn't try too hard. When we paused at the overlook, she touched the railing. I didn't understand before, she said. Not really. I've been staging rooms my whole life. This isn't a room. This is a neighbor. I said. That afternoon, Graham called to schedule a meeting. He brought a lawyer and a foundation officer who spoke in bullet points and beneficial tax implications. I brought the district superintendent and a science teacher who smelled faintly of whiteboard markers and sea salt. For an hour, we talked in two languages, his, measured in naming rights and reach, mine, measured in hands and hours. A few times, we almost missed each other completely. Then the teacher, a woman with silver hair and a voice like a bell tower, took out a mason jar and set it on the table. Inside, a single steel grass, a snail that had mistaken fame for a new tide pool. This, she said, tapping the glass with a fingernail, is the curriculum. This jar is all most of my students have ever been allowed to see of a coast. You want your name on a thing? Fine. Put it on a bus that brings kids here instead of on a plaque they can't read. Something in Graham's face unfastened. Maybe it was pride unhooking itself from habit. Maybe it was respect finally finding purchase where advertising slides off. How many buses? He asked. Enough, she said, and he laughed, genuinely, a sound not curated for a room. Start with 12. We'll name the routes for currents instead of donors. He nodded. The lawyer blinked. The foundation officer wrote currents and underlined it, as if underlining could keep the word from running away. In the quiet after they left, the superintendent turned to me. You do realize you just got Mercer money to buy diesel, she said, half amused, half awed. We'll get them to fund electrics next year, I said. You can move a man in steps he'll claim were his idea. That evening, Noah came by with a folder fat enough to matter. Lists of programs, deadlines, essays that began, I used to lie without using untrue words. He spread them across the kitchen table. Like a deck, he wasn't pitching, but offering. We read aloud. We cut the parts where he apologized, as if shame could count as experience. We sharpened the places where the work lived. At one point he stopped and looked at the house, the way a person looks at a mirror that's finally been cleaned. I used to think I wanted a life that looked like a life, he said. Turns out I want the thing itself. I poured coffee. He wrote until the ink struggled to keep up. We didn't perform it for anyone. We didn't send a photo to prove the moment to a crowd we don't owe. We just sat there. A mother reading and a son rewriting and a night attending to itself like a tide minding the moon. Later, when he left with a stack of drafts and a promise to come early for the district meeting, I stood at the open door and watched Harbor Point breathe. Porch lights. A dog on a leash deciding which patch of grass is urgent. Somewhere down the bluff, wind-chimed a fence someone hung because they liked the sound of their own weather. Inside, the TV was dark. My phone slept. The house hummed the way houses do when they're finally being used for what they were built to hold. People will tell you redemption is a moment. They've never built anything. Redemption is a practice. It's a site visit and a draft and a meeting where you keep your voice level when the person across from you tries to buy your purpose with a pen. It's a son hosting his own undoing and finding the frame he wants to build inside next. It's a woman choosing, again, the quiet work over the loud approval, and to sometimes the quiet work echoes farther. Before I turned out the last light, I walked the hall and laid my palm on the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. Wood holds heat longer than stone, less than flesh. It remembered me. In the reflection on the glass, I saw Harbor Point and a woman who didn't move away from herself when the camera came close. I raised 2 fingers and made a small promise to the room and to the day that had led here. More buses, more chimes, more children whose first word for ocean isn't picture. And a son, seated at a table somewhere, who now knows you can say, I don't own this, and still belong to it completely. 3 weeks after the broadcast, the tide of attention finally hit shore. Not the pleasant lap of praise, but the drag and surge of consequence. A clip of me telling Graham Mercer to leave the gloves in the car ricocheted across feeds and professional forums where men prefer their purpose pre-sanitized. The comments split cleanly, like driftwood after a storm, half calling me a wealth shamer, half asking how to build a boardwalk without crushing a living thing. Then a letter landed from the Harbor Point Conservancy, neighbors with ocean views and ironed consciences, warning that opening their coastline to school groups would increase traffic, jeopardize property values, and violate the character of the community. They CC'd the Coastal Commission, the city attorney, and a council member who smiles like a realtor's postcard. Attention, as I've said, is not support. We moved anyway. Sloane came at dawn that Monday with her rolled tube, hair tied in a practical knot that made her look like the student she'd put away. She placed dowels along the path and struck each with a mallet so gently you could barely hear it. Then she stood still and listened. Wind fussed the leaves. The first chime answered in a low bell, barely music, mostly air taught to sing. "They'll follow this," she said. "Not because it's loud, but because it's true." Adriana watched with arms crossed, not in disapproval, but as if hugging herself through a change she hadn't packed for. Before lunch, the superintendent called. The council had agendized our permit for community input. I've sat through enough hearings to know input often means people who arrived last deciding who belongs. The meeting was Thursday night. I said I'd be there. Noah said, "Me too," in the voice you use when you're tired of being the man who shows up after the thing's already built. The backlash bloomed in small irritations. An anonymous note in my mailbox. "Keep the buses out." A polite email from a neighbor asking that we relocate a chime because the tone is intrusive at breakfast. A foundation officer requesting to preview signage concepts to ensure brand alignment. I wrote responses that were shorter than my temper and kinder than my mood. "We'll publish bus schedules so you can plan errands. The chimes sing at school hours only. There is no signage for sale." On Thursday, we walked into the council chamber, the way you walk into a doctor's office, knowing your body, still bracing for the diagnosis. The room smelled like carpet and compromise. A man in a blazer that broadcast HOA treasurer read a statement about hordes of unsupervised minors. A woman with $500,000 worth of glass behind her kitchen table lamented noise pollution from educational devices. When my turn came, I spoke the language this room respects: numbers, ratios, impacts. 3 buses per week to start, 6 adults per class. Boardwalks removable during high surf events, a pilot period with measurable outcomes, and a sunset clause if we fail. I left poetry at home and brought a ledger. Then a hand rose at the back. Not Graham, not Adriana, not a donor at all. The silver-haired science teacher from the planning meeting stepped to the mic in her weathered sandals and held up the mason jar. Inside, eelgrass, water the color of home. "Every year," she said, "I show my students a coast in a jar because the coast itself is locked behind view easements and private stairs." She tapped the glass. "We don't need more protection from children. We need protection for children, from the idea that the ocean is something you look at." It was not rhetoric, it was a bell. Sloane spoke next. She didn't mention her parents. She mentioned winter sun angles and auditory wayfinding, and how chimes slow bodies without scolding them. Noah followed. "And if you're expecting a pitch, you haven't been paying attention." He told the room he'd spent a year trying to belong by borrowing shine, and that the only thing he'd earned was the right to tell the truth. "We will be careful," he said simply, "because the person who taught me this place is not a backdrop, lives here." The council member with the postcard smile shifted in his chair like a man remembering a beach he used to know. We won the permit by 1 vote, with a 6-month review and a list of conditions that read like a dare. We accepted every one. Outside, under the municipal oaks and a streetlight humming the note of fluorescent compromise, Graham shook my hand. "Gloves in the car," he said. It sounded less like a concession now, and more like an agreement between people who could be useful to each other without pretending to be the same. 2 days later, the pilot began. 24 fourth graders, 3 teachers, a bus driver who waved like we were old friends, and then cried in the driver's seat when he saw the water. The chimes worked. Children moved as if following a story they could hear. At the first overlook, a boy with a buzz cut and a laugh built for recess gripped the railing and forgot to perform toughness. "It's moving," he said, astonished, as if he'd expected the ocean to be a GIF. Halfway through the lesson, the weather turned in that quick Pacific way. Sun to gray to a wind that slapped the cheeks of everyone who'd dressed for Instagram. We pivoted. Boardwalk up, kids to the boathouse, hot chocolate in paper cups, impromptu lesson on fronts and fetch. A gust took a hat, and the boy with the laugh bolted toward the edge, instinct first. Noah got there before fear did and scooped him by the shoulders with the calm of a man who has finally chosen to be useful. He crouched to kid height. "We watch first," he said. "The ocean does not reward fast." After, the superintendent wrote a note that smelled faintly of sea air even through a screen. One parent said her child had never been this close to the Pacific. He asked if they could go again without a jar. I saved it in a folder labeled Proof. The day the first check arrived from the Mercers Foundation, no plaque, just buses, Adriana came alone. No entourage, sneakers again. She stood by a chime and waited until the wind gave her a note. "I was wrong," she said. It cost her something to say it. You could hear the currency in her voice. "I thought beauty was something you curated. I didn't understand you could host it." I didn't absolve her. I nodded once, the ceremony of women who have been handed both scorn and compliments like unpaid invoices. "Help us host it well," I said. She exhaled, and some part of her clothes relaxed the way fabric does when the body inside stops bracing. That night, Noah brought over a stack of drafts with fewer apologies and more verbs. We worked until the house hummed with the sounds I bought it to hold. Pages, pencils, the soft percussion of a sentence finding its weight. When he left, the rain started, a gentle tap that promised harder weather. I walked the veranda, checking tie-downs and the way the new drains took the water like they were built to. On the path below, the chimes spoke to the wind. Not loud, not plaintive, certain. There will be more hearings, more letters, more men who want their names on rails, and more mothers who don't know how to say they're proud without sounding like surrender. There will be mornings, the tide takes a board, and afternoons a child learns that the ocean keeps its own time. There will be a party at Noah's apartment where he puts down the old costume for good. There will be sketches from Sloane that hum with wind and graphite and a life she is finally walking toward. And there will be this. A bus route named for a current pulling what needs to move, the sound of a chime telling 30 feet to slow down and listen, and a house that has learned to hold more than a view. People, purpose, the weather of a life being lived at its actual size. The first true storm of the season announced itself with the blunt manners of the Pacific. No ceremony, just a sky tightening like a fist, and a wind that pressed its hand flat against the windows to see who lived here. The forecast called it a significant event, which is coastal for Fairmaristingerd. You'll learn what your decisions weigh. By noon, the whitecaps had teeth. By 3, the gulls flew low and mean. By 5, I had sandbags stacked, boardwalk sections unbolted and stowed, and 3 volunteers in rain shells sorting ropes into clean coils that would not betray us in a hurry. "Protocols?" Noah asked, shrugging into a jacket that had belonged to his father and somehow still fit a son who'd grown in different directions. He had a list in his hand. It was damp and legible, a description of a young man learning the exact place where ideal meets weather. "Finish stow," I said. "Bar the boathouse vents. Check the chime posts." He nodded and moved, not quickly, not lazily, precisely. Outside, Sloane and Adriana came up the path under the same umbrella, a small treaty carried on a metal spine. "I brought earplugs," Sloane said wryly, "in case your storm is louder than your chimes." "The chimes are for the air that listens," I said. "Storms are for people." We worked like a crew who'd practiced together, even if we hadn't. The chime posts held. The mallet strikes we'd placed a palm's breadth deeper than the permit required were a quiet vindication. Graham arrived late, wrong shoes, right face. He didn't offer advice. He did exactly what I told him to do, and for a man who's accustomed to directing a world into compliance, obedience can be the purest form of regard. Dusk fell early, heavy. Harbor Point narrowed to a perimeter of lights. Inside, the house found its storm voice. Studs creaking, glass humming a single unwavering note, pipes pinging like distant bells. We sat in the kitchen with a map, a thermos, and battery lanterns that made everybody look like a person in a story told long ago. Sloane rolled out her latest sketches, the wayfinding plan marked in graphite and tiny blue pencil notes where sound should live. Adriana watched, chin on fist, the posture of a woman who has lately spent more time listening than curating. "Will they hold?" Graham asked, meaning the posts, meaning the idea. "Nothing holds forever," I said, "but we build for most weather and plan for the rest." At midnight, the storm peaked. Rain sheeted sideways. The ocean leapt the low rocks and smacked the hewn steps with a scorn older than zoning. I walked the veranda like a captain in a calm voice she doesn't always feel. The chimes answered in fractions, notes chopped by wind, a broken song still recognizable as the thing it was. When the biggest gust hit, and you always know it by the way the house flinches and then decides to stay, a single chime sang whole, a low bell that vibrated the window panes, and then us. Sloane closed her eyes and smiled, wet lashes bright in lantern light. "That's the note," she whispered. "That's the one that tells you to stay human." Morning came humid and wrecked. We stepped out into the aftermath that counts for victory in a coastal town. Nothing gone we cannot replace, things broken in ways that teach you how to fix them right. A section of railing took the night off. A gutter elbow had given up its ordinary job and sucked eelgrass into a corner of the yard. But the posts stood, the boardwalk stacked. The house remembered we'd asked it to shelter more than a body. Down the path, the beach had been purified in the brutal way storms prefer. Loose sand scraped, rock lines redrawn, a new pool cut where there had not been one yesterday. We went to look. The new basin was deep and cupped like a hand, alive already. A flash of opalescent shell, 2 anemones closed as fists, a strand of kelp draped like ribbon. "We didn't build this," Noah said, as if he were admitting a theft that had failed. "No," I said, "but we can host it better now." 2 days later, our first post-storm class arrived. 23 fifth graders who'd rehearsed their excitement on the bus and then lost it to awe at the first overlook. The chimes, we'd tuned one down a semitone after the storm, steered them like a gentle hand on a shoulder. The new pool became a lesson in recent history. "Yesterday," Sloane told them, crouched in loner boots that made a better kind of sense on her than heels ever had, "this wasn't here. Weather is a builder too." Adriana stood back and handed out hand warmers and cups of broth, like a flight attendant in a different life, saying, "Careful, just often enough to count as love." By the end of the week, I had a voicemail from the council member with the realtor smile, asking if the chimes could be demonstrated at a neighborhood event. "They are not an installation," I said in the return call, pleasantly. "They are a path." He laughed, the tender little laugh of a man who knows the difference and wants you to know he knows it, even if he will still ask for the wrong thing on principle. We navigated more letters. One demanded a sound study. We sent decibel readings lower than a dishwasher and a list of times the chimes slept. Another fretted about parking. We published a bus drop-off plan that kept wheels out of cul-de-sacs named for flowers that never grew there. And then, unexpectedly, a thank you card arrived with no return address. Thick paper, careful penmanship, a drawing of a sea star that looked like it had been copied from life and not a clip art sheet. Inside, 3 sentences. "My son has autism. He followed the chimes like a story and didn't run once. He slept." On a Tuesday, an email pinged with a subject line that made my fingers go cold. "Application update." Noah read it over my shoulder because sometimes you have to be the person who doesn't let another person open a door alone. "Accepted," it said. "Cohort in Sustainable Enterprise. Essay noted for clarity without theatrics." We didn't shout. We stood there, 2 mammals absorbing the news into bone. Then he put his forehead to mine the way he did when he was small and had an earache. "I thought I wanted permission," he said. "Turns out I wanted work." That night we walked the path at dusk, the hour the chimes sound like they're remembering something. Graham met us halfway, no tie, hands in the pockets of a jacket that had stopped needing to impress anyone. "Our board approved a second round of bus funding," he said. "Conditioned on a quarterly report." He winced before I could. "Content determined by you." "Good," I said. "We'll measure wonder in hours." He laughed, and this time there wasn't any marketing in it. Sloane sent a draft of the signage we weren't going to build. sketches of negative space arrows, an alphabet for listening, a small brass plate at the boathouse door that read, simply, "Welcome." She titled the packet, "Things We Don't Need." I put it on the corkboard under a Polaroid of the first class pointing at the new pool as if the present were a magic trick. The second storm arrived with less drama and more instruction. We moved through the motions like dancers whose bodies have learned the counts. A post needed resetting. We did. A neighbor who'd written an angry email dropped off hot chocolate mix in a brown paper bag like a truce left on a doorstep. Adriana came alone and stayed late, stapling permission forms and asking tentatively whether she could sponsor field notebooks if they didn't say her name. "Only if they fit in a pocket," I said. A pocket is a promise a child makes to themselves. At the end of the month, Tessa called. "The network wants a follow-up," she said, "not a victory lap. A what now?" "What now?" I said, looking out at a horizon that pretended not to know my name and loved me anyway. "Now we make enough quiet to fit the loud thing that is learning. Now we dig drains that move water where it's already headed. Now we fund buses named for currents and we don't put our names on them." "And Noah?" she asked, because she is a narrator who understands the grammar of arcs. "He'll be reading case studies and mowing the path on weekends," I said. "He's learning that the same muscles turn a sentence and a spade." "And Sloane?" "She's designing a melody," I said. "It sounds like restraint." "And you, Evelyn?" I watched a gull draw a line through air as clean as a signature on a document that changes a life. "I'm hosting," I said. "Beauty, weather, fourth graders, arguments I don't win, and the version of my son who finally knows how to stand still in a storm long enough to be useful." After I hung up, I walked down to the new pool alone. The tide had left it a handful of small treasures and one bright candy wrapper from a life that thinks it's always invited. I picked the plastic out, put it in my pocket, and let the rest be. The water held the sky without distortion for a long breath, and then a breeze scribbled on its surface and the picture changed. Somewhere up on the path, the chimes gave a single simple note. It wasn't an announcement, it was a reminder. We're here. We move, we listen. We keep building for the weather we have and the people we love enough to bring into it. By spring, the house had learned the rhythm of children. The path woke first. Wind catching the chimes in a tone so soft it felt like a thought you could hear. Then the gravel murmured under bus tires. Then laughter arrived and filled every seam the ocean left open. We named the routes for currents: Kuroshio, Humboldt, California, not for donors, and the only plaque on the boathouse door read, "Welcome." On opening day, the superintendent cut a ribbon fashioned from beach grass. The tape wouldn't snap, it had to be untied, which felt right. Tessa came back with a smaller crew for the follow-up she promised. No drones, no hero shots, just the sound of sneakers on boardwalk and a close-up of a hand hovering over an anemone that folded like a shy fist. "What now?" she asked off-camera. I told her the truest sentence I own. Now we do the work again tomorrow. Noah stood beside me in boots he would not have chosen a year ago, sleeves pushed to his elbows, hair damp with the kind of weather that ignores gel. He'd accepted a place in a sustainable enterprise cohort and carried a folder fat with reading that would change the way he saw a balance sheet. Between classes, he'd be here on weekends, mowing the path, tuning chimes, writing grant copy stripped of adjectives that pretend to be evidence. When a kid lost his footing on the rocks, Noah's hand appeared at his shoulder with the easy calm of a man who'd finally learned where usefulness lives. He spoke less now and said more. It's not that he stopped wanting to be seen, he just learned to be worth looking at when no one's filming. Sloane arrived in work pants and a sun-bleached ball cap, a pencil tucked behind her ear like a small, stubborn flag. Her wayfinding system sang. Children followed the melody as if it were a story they knew by heart. She turned down an invitation to design a flagship boutique and chose instead to draw quiet things that teach a body to listen: shade, breeze, the angle of winter sun. At night, she sketched a pavilion of shells and shadow for a tide pool lecture, a space that could vanish between storms without leaving a wound. Adriana started showing up early with clipboards and permission slips, the neatest name block printing I've ever seen. She ordered field notebooks that fit in a pocket and refused her name on the inside cover. The only mark was a small embossed outline of a sea star. "Let it be found, not announced," she said, and I nodded, because that sentence could carry an entire life. Graham learned to arrive without an entourage. He stood at the overlook one afternoon and watched a class go still at the sight of a cormorant drying its wings. "We used to call that dead space in a show," he murmured. "Now I think it's the point." He redirected foundation money toward buses and boots and a fund for broken glasses, the unglamorous line items that actually move children through a day. Our quarterly reports measured hours outside, new words learned, teacher return rates, metrics no brand can polish because they come with dirt. The neighborhood softened by increments. A man who'd sent me 3 angry emails brought hot chocolate mix when the second storm cut the power. A woman who'd objected to noise pollution walked the path at dusk and left a note on my door that read, "I didn't know the chimes could sound like thinking." The council member with the postcard smile requested a selfie and got a tour instead. He left without a photo, and with a list of erosion fixes the city should have paid for 10 years ago. That night, crews arrived with gravel and shovels. Sometimes progress is a politician who has the sense to borrow your homework. When the season's last bus pulled away, the path exhaled. The ocean did what it always does, kept its appointment with the rocks, and the house at last was only a house again. Wet footprints drying on the deck, a forgotten mitten on the railing, the faint salt lace the wind leaves on glass. I walked the boards and touched each post as if taking a pulse. The chimes were still, holding their breath like instruments between movements. Inside, on the corkboard, we'd pinned a month of drawings, kelp in crayon, crabs in marker, a watercolor star that bled at the edges in the most honest way. In the corner, Noah's acceptance letter curled at one corner from coastal air. Beside it, Sloane's plan for a seasonal pavilion waited for permits we would earn with patience, not pressure. Tessa sent the cut a week later. 22 quiet minutes that never raised its voice and somehow said everything. No climaxes, no crescendos. Just arrivals, buses, weather, understanding. The final shot was a child's hand held open over a tide pool, waiting for a tiny crab to decide whether the world outside the water might be a place to cross. The credits rolled without music. When the screen went black, you could still hear the wind in the microphone, the ocean humming its old, unsellable song. People will ask what changed. The honest answer is smaller than they want and bigger than they think. A son chose work over performance. A woman remembered the vocation she'd been trained to rebrand. A family learned how to touch without leaving fingerprints. A town made room for a sound that isn't its own. And a house that once pretended to be a status symbol became what it should have been all along. A good neighbor with its door open and its lights on. At dusk, when the path sings a single note and Harbor Point clicks into constellations, I stand on the veranda and take the same vow I took on day 1, the only promise that isn't empty on a shoreline. Build what outlasts you. Teach it to welcome, and trust the tide to edit you into the truest version of yourself. By summer's end, the path had a memory. You could feel it under your feet, the places where children slowed because the chimes asked them to. The boards that learned to carry 24 small bodies and 2 heavy questions at once. What is this, and what do I do with what I know now? The first class we'd hosted came back in matching t-shirts they'd made themselves, Sharpie kelp lopsided stars, and announced they were volunteers. Not a request, a declaration. One boy handed me a folded paper like a treaty, a schedule and block letters with "We can lift stuff" underlined twice. That afternoon, they moved gravel like a choir, out of rhythm, full of heart, strangely efficient. Noah's cohort started in August, and he parted the week like a tide. Weekdays, in lecture halls where externalities finally meant something bigger than a slide. Weekends at Harbor Point with his boots on the boards and a clipboard that had more checkmarks than ideas. He built a spreadsheet for the bus routes that made the superintendent sigh with relief and the drivers nod like he'd finally learned their language. "You don't have to name a current to respect it," he told me one night, eyes cratered from case studies and salt. "You just have to stop pretending it won't move you." He spoke less about optics and more about weight, what plans weigh, what promises weigh, What a fourth grader's hand in yours weighs when a sneaker slips and you hold steady without making a sermon of the save. Sloane signed a lease on a small studio above a bait shop that smelled like the past. She furnished it with 2 sawhorses, a door for a desk, and a drafting lamp that made the whole room feel like it had something worth illuminating. She turned down a boutique in Miami with a sentence that startled even her parents. "I'm designing for weather, not windows." By fall, she had a waiting list of public spaces no one thought deserved design. Bus stops, shade structures, a pocket library that taught wind to turn pages gently. At night, she slid her studio window open and let the chimes score her drawings. When Graham climbed the stairs and saw the work taped to the walls, graphite, grease pencil notation, he stood longer than a man like him stands, then left without advice. Later he texted one line, "You found the seam between listening and leading." She pinned it up like a strange kind of blueprint. Adriana kept showing up early with pocket-sized notebooks and a thermos that could heat a small room. She had started using the word "we" without checking who else was in the sentence. One morning, a neighbor who had once written me a manifesto about neighborhood character handed her a stack of laminated permission slips and asked where to file them. Adriana didn't flinch, didn't gloat. "Same place as apologies," she said lightly, and slid them into a labeled bin. "Intake." Afterward, she stood at the overlook and watched a cormorant spread black wings to dry, the pose that looks like benediction if you've been starved of it. "Some things are beautiful because they refuse to hurry," she said, "not to me, not to anyone in particular," and the chime behind her nodded with a low vowel of agreement. The follow-up piece Tessa cut aired between a cooking show and a city council debate that boiled down to parking. 22 quiet minutes that made noise by refusing to. She didn't chase drama, she let consequence show its slow teeth. Viewers wrote letters that weren't about me at all. Notes about their own coasts, their own classrooms, their own small rooms where truth might fit if someone moved the furniture. A teacher in the Gulf sent a photo of a plastic kiddie pool full of brackish water and a caption that read, "Until we can get to the shore." A mayor in a Midwestern river town asked for Sloane's wayfinding plan because water is water, even if you can't taste salt. We started a folder called Blueprints That Travel and put it on a drive anyone could open without a password or a pitch deck. A lawyer friend warned me about IP. "I'm into public," I said, "not property." A month later, the Harbor Point Conservancy, new board, softer edges, invited us to present at their gala. The invite read, "Black tie optional," which is rich people code for brown. "We'll judge anyway." I said yes on the condition that the centerpiece budget buy field boots in kids' sizes. They blinked, recalculated, complied. Graham arrived in a tux that looked like Grace on loan and whispered, "Gloves in the car," like a private joke that had grown into policy. Adriana wore flats she could walk a boardwalk in. Sloane went in a dress with pockets deep enough to hold a tape measure and a pencil, and she used both before dessert. Noah, in the only suit he owned, spent the evening moving donors toward the bus fund without once using the words impact or transformative. He asked about childhood beaches and let people talk themselves into generosity. Afterwards, he sent thank you notes without a single exclamation point. "Enthusiasm reads as debt," he said. "Gratitude reads as belonging." Not everything bent our way. A storm snapped a post we thought unbreakable. A parent complained that her child came home with damp socks and a new word she didn't like. Barnacle. A city inspector got precious about clearance heights and forgot that wind doesn't read code. We lost an afternoon to a meeting where a man explained my own chimes to me like I hadn't tuned them. But the path kept singing and the buses kept coming and the jar stayed on the teacher's desk as a reminder of what belongs where. On days when my patience went brittle, I'd walk down at night and sit by the new tide pool, the one the storm had carved without our permission or our help, and watch the stars land in it, 10 at a time. I learned to count breath in waves, 4 in, 6 out. The ocean refused to be impressed, and I took comfort in that. One Saturday, the original boy, the one with the buzz cut and the laugh, arrived holding his mother's hand and a shoebox with holes punched in the lid. He set it on the table like an offering. Inside, a booklet he'd made titled Things I Can Name Now. The pages were drawings and labels. Messy, proud, precise in the way childhood is precise when it matters. He pointed at the final page. "This is me," he said, and he'd drawn himself as a stick figure kneeling over a pool, hands behind his back. The caption read, "I don't touch first." I looked at his mother. She shrugged through tears. "He sleeps," she said. "He didn't before." Noah's midterms came and went, and left him wrecked and reassembled, less interested in being right and more interested in being useful. He started a working paper with 2 classmates on the economics of buses versus plaques and sent it to the foundation without spin. Graham forwarded it to his board with the subject line, "The only ROI that won't embarrass us in 10 years. Adriana led a quiet campaign among her circle for pocket notebooks and snacks that don't crumble in wind. Sloane redrew the winter sun angles after a week of gray made the boardwalk slick. She sketched a canopy that would catch rain and release it exactly where the plants asked for it. I watched her draw water like a person who had learned to apologize to it first. We said no more often. No to a brand that wanted to shoot an ad at Magic Hour. No to a podcast that wanted a gotcha about luxury folk learning feelings. No to an influencer who asked if the chimes could be tuned more vibey. We said yes to a public school that needed an extra bus on a week with a broken boiler. Yes to a fisheries grad student who wanted to run a low-stakes study on tide pool health. Yes to a retired carpenter who built a bench at the Overlook and carved one word into it with a pocket knife. Stay. In late fall, Tessa visited without a crew. She walked the path in silence. No questions, no nods for camera, just hands in her pockets and the economy of a woman off duty. At the Overlook, she stood a long time. Finally, she said, "We don't get to keep many stories. They belong to the hour they were told." She turned toward me. This one keeps writing itself without us." I thought of draft plans, bus schedules, broken posts, a shoebox with holes. "Good," I said. Then we built it right. That evening, a thin moon cut the water and Harbor Point clicked on one house at a time like a map of answers. The chimes gave a single certain note, and I stood on the veranda with a cup of tea, cooling faster than I could drink it. Inside, Noah's essay draft lay open to a paragraph that began, "I used to think dignity was something you borrowed from a room." Sloane's pencil sat where she'd left it, a bright little promise. Adriana's pocket notebooks were stacked in a crate by the door, spines unbranded, ready, and the bus schedule for winter, Humboldt, Kuroshio, California, was taped to the corkboard. A liturgy of arrivals no one would applaud and everyone would feel. People ask sometimes if the house feels different now that it has a job. I tell them it feels like a good neighbor. Lights on, door open, a path that sings you in, and a bench that tells you to stay long enough to remember the names of things. The rest, the broadcasts, the letters, the storms, the compromises, the small victories that don't trend, are weather. We build for most of it. We plan for the rest. And on nights when the ocean hums her old, unsellable song, I let it remind me of the only vow that held from the beginning. Build what outlasts you, teach it to welcome, and trust that if you listen long enough, the truth will learn your name and answer back. By winter's edge, the project no longer felt like a project. It felt like a season the town had learned to enter. The buses arrived with steam on their windows. The path sang its low, certain vowels, and a procession of small boots negotiated the boardwalk like a polite parade. We'd added one new current, Alaskan, to the route list after a fisheries grad student argued that naming a cold flow would teach children the shape of weather they couldn't see. The chime keyed for that stop carried a cooler tone. Sloane swore she could hear latitude in it. Adriana kept a stash of knit caps in a bin labeled "Take Return" and never counted how many came back. She had learned the discipline of believing in circulation. On a gray Thursday, I watched Noah teach without a script. He'd been practicing a different kind of sentence in his cohort, leaner, more hinged to evidence. And it showed. "Value is not a decal," he told a ring of fifth graders clustered at the new tide pool. "It's how you behave toward a place that cannot applaud you." One kid, all elbows and bravado, asked if the ocean could fail. Noah considered him the way you consider a wave you haven't named yet. "It can be failed," he said. "It can be failed by people, but it doesn't stop being an ocean." The boy nodded like someone who'd been given both a warning and a job. Tessa's follow-up aired and then did something rare for TV. It went quiet. Not a spike, not a clapback, just a steady trickle of emails from towns we'd never visited asking for the Harbor Point packet. We stripped our documents of everything that looked like brand and uploaded the rest. Boardwalk specs, chime tunings, bus schedules, letter templates for council hearings. The language we used to say no when no was the only moral sentence. The file was titled Take, Adjust, Return. People did. A river city in Ohio tuned bicycle bells to guide children along a floodplain path. A desert school swapped chimes for wind shadows cast by perforated metal and taught students to follow the shade. A coastal county in the Carolinas named their routes for birds. None of it looked like ours. All of it felt like kin. Graham called to say the foundation had formalized the bus fund as a permanent line item. We buried it under operations, he admitted, amused, so no one can perform generosity with it at the gala. He'd begun to talk about giving in terms of friction, not headlines. Adriana, meanwhile, had shifted her orbit quietly. She now kept her planner on our kitchen island 3 mornings a week, toggling between permission slips and a calendar that still had fittings and trunk shows but fewer red exclamation points. She'd started signing her emails with a single line she borrowed from a chime note. Moving, not loud. Sloane's winter pavilion rose and vanished with the tide in a way that made the inspector reluctantly happy. It qualified as semi-permanent, which is bureaucracy for, we can't hate this. The structure looked like wind taught to behave. Shell-white ribs, shadow that traveled like a clock across the lecture floor. When the first class stood beneath it during a rain squall, the sound on the roof turned the lesson into percussion, and every face tilted up. We designed attention, Sloane whispered, as if the word were an animal you could spook. At home, the house performed its second vocation with the same grace as the first, host to weather, host to people. The bench at the overlook, stay carved by a retired carpenter with steady hands, had worn to a satin sheen under 1,000 small decision-makings. We found our rhythm with the neighborhood. The conservancy, reshaped by new members who preferred verbs to bylaws, used their budget to fix trail drains instead of commissioning renderings of birds that didn't land here anymore. The council member with the postcard smile brought his kids one Saturday and let them get mud on shoes he couldn't write off. I used to think my job was to keep things the same, he confessed, later with his back to the railing. Turns out my job is to keep room for what's next. Noah's cohort asked him to present on authenticity as operating policy, a title he resisted and then accepted when he realized it didn't have to be a performance. He built his deck with one slide that wasn't a slide at all, a photo of the shoebox with holes, the booklet titled Things I Can Name Now, and the caption, Metrics that matter tend to carry crayons. He came home to the kitchen table and set the laptop down like it contained something still alive. They didn't clap, he said and smiled. They wrote. We lost things. A storm took a board and made us rethink fasteners. A chime cracked on a day nothing else did, reminding us that objects absorb stress we pretend is ours alone. A grant fell through because we refused a logo big enough to read from space. We gained other things. A grandmother insisted on translating tide pool vocabulary into Spanish on laminated cards, and now children taught their parents beside the water. A surfer stopped by with a jar of beach glass and a map of rip currents. His tattoos made the superintendent hesitate and then trust him forever. At dusk, a pair of oyster catchers returned to a rock they hadn't used in years, and I had to set down the rake because my hands were already occupied with gratitude. Tessa visited one afternoon without cameras and left a single line in our guest book. Some stories teach the town to write. I placed a finger on the sentence as if checking its pulse. It beat. On the last day before winter break, the buses lined up under a sky the color of weather. Children filed past the welcome plaque without pausing to read it. They didn't need to. They knew the door. The Alaskan chime gave its cool note, and the Humboldt answered lower down, and the path gathered them in like a sentence that knows where it's headed. Noah stepped aside for a teacher carrying a stack of pocket notebooks. Sloane tightened the pavilion's quick release with a habit that had become muscle. Adriana taped a fresh return label on the cap bin, and Graham arrived late with a thermos and no tie, which for him is a declaration. We stood at the overlook while a boy held his hand open over the tide pool, palm up, not grasping, and waited for a crab to make the brave decision to cross a human bridge. It did, because sometimes the smallest creature in the story understands the assignment better than the rest of us. The class cheered, the wind applauded in its own unruly way, and the ocean did not bother to notice. She moved as always, editing our edges into something truer. That night, after lights clicked on up and down Harbor Point, I walked the path and touched each post as if blessing a choir. At the bench I sat and listened for a long time to a note that wasn't quite there, and then was, low, certain, the sound a place makes when it begins to know its name. We hadn't solved anything permanent. We had built something that invited better attempts. Sometimes that is the exact size of redemption. A door that stays open, a bus that keeps coming, a chime tuned to the frequency of patience, and a house that learned to be a neighbor until the people inside it did too.